Thanks for being here. I'm Caitlin Coleman, Water Education Colorado's Publications and Digital Resources Managing Editor. I'm excited to present today's webinar, Breaking Now, What's Fresh in Water News. I am here with our panelists and with our amazing Tess Koskovich, who is going to be moderating the chat and organizing your questions as they come in. And of course, we have our panelist, Shannon Mullane, who covers the Colorado River Basin for the Colorado Sun, and Jerd Smith, the editor of Freshwater News. Before we get started, just a quick note to remain muted during our presentations. We'll allow about 15 minutes to hear your questions at the end of our time together. And so at that point, we'll invite you to turn on your cameras as you want, or unmute yourself if you want to pose questions. If you wish to communicate or type out questions during the presentations or during Q&A, you can just use the chat. And if you ask questions during our presentations, we'll just circle back to those later during the Q&A period. Also, the webinar is being recorded. We'll share the recording within the next week with all of you and post it on our website. I know many of you are old friends and familiar with our organization, but if you're new to Water Education Colorado, our nonprofit works to ensure that Coloradans are informed on water issues and equipped to make decisions that guide our state to a sustainable water future. We're a non-advocacy organization committed to providing educational opportunities and engaging Coloradans around water. We do this in a variety of ways through leadership programs, educational programs like this webinar, and of course, water news coverage and publications. Our membership program supports this work, and members receive discounts on programs like today's webinar, a subscription to our magazine, and other benefits. In 2018, Water Education Colorado launched Freshwater News as an independent, nonpartisan news initiative to report on water issues in Colorado and across the American West. Freshwater News has released original weekly water reporting since then, and hopefully you're all subscribers, but if you aren't a subscriber, we'll pop a link into the chat where you can sign up to receive weekly water news in your inbox. You can also read the news on our website or on the Colorado Sun site. In November of 2023, the Colorado Sun and Freshwater News embarked on a co-publishing relationship where we collectively report, edit, and publish stories. So that is kind of what's going on with WECO and Freshwater News. The spark of our webinar today was to bring some element of Water Education Colorado's fall issue of Headwaters magazine to life. We try to organize a webinar to dive deeper into the content of each issue of Headwaters. And last fall's issue had a Water 101 theme, which provided a lot of great background info on water, but we also pulled in some current news stories to illustrate that 101 info. So today we're really just focusing on the news, of course, but we hope to provide enough rich content to give you a look at what our reporters see as some of the biggest stories coming in water. With all that background, let's hear from our panelists. We'll start off hearing from Shannon about what's going on the Colorado River. And then Jerd will talk about what she sees as the 3 biggest news stories for the year outside of the Colorado River. Shannon?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see, a few videos and see a bunch of names. I recognize a few of them. So thank you for joining today. Really appreciate it. If you're not familiar with, with this crowd, probably you are, but if you're not familiar with my coverage, I'm the Colorado River reporter for the Colorado Sun. I've been doing it since early 2023, and it's basically the core of my beat. I help with water issues, covering water issues around the state as well, but really I'm watching what's happening in this basin. There are lots of important things happening in all of the river basins in Colorado, and that's why we have this partnership with Jerd and some other reporters to cover everything. So I'm sure that you all, if you've been following the news, you might have heard a little bit about negotiations that are happening. So I figured we should probably talk about that and what's new with those. And then it is a complex basin. It does have complex issues. So if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer those. I'll also be talking about this kind of in both the basic level, and since some of you also have a lot of expertise in this area, we'll be talking about some of the more advanced issues as well. So I'll be doing a little bit of explanation as we go. But thank you so much for joining. So I think if you are familiar with the negotiations that are happening with the Colorado River Basin, that's great. There's been some news stories recently and some updates recently where we now know that we're supposed to be looking really hard at progress on these negotiations in May. But what the heck am I talking about if you're not familiar with this? Basically, the Colorado River Basin, I can show you a slide. Let's do a visual just for fun. But the Colorado River Basin is let's see here. We got it. Okay. It's quite large. It spreads into 7 different states, and it means that 7 different states are involved with managing the future of the water supply for the 40 million people that do draw from the Colorado River. As you can see on the map to the left, it starts in Colorado. It has tributaries that start in other states, and then it flows all the way down to where it used to reach the Gulf of California, but now it kind of dwindles in Mexico. So the negotiations we're talking about are these 7 states trying to reach some sort of agreement over how to manage the Colorado River's water supply. They're not solely in charge of this. They're working with the federal government. This whole planning process is managed by the federal government, but the timeline that we're working on right now is trying to get our water supply plan figured out by 2026. So I've covered a lot of high level stuff there. So let's start breaking it down a little bit. When we're talking about this water supply, you can see on this map that everyone in Colorado, or a lot of people in Colorado, these little like diagonally striped areas, that are slightly outside of the dark line of the basin, including the Front Range, like they get water from the Colorado River Basin. So 40 million people, lots of people are tied into how this river is going to be managed in the future. Right now, it's being managed by these guidelines that were established in 2007. So when I'm saying managed, I'm talking about specifically, or since 2007, how 2 specific huge reservoirs have stored and released water. That's Glen Canyon Dam. It's right there close to the Utah-Arizona border, and that's Lake Mead right there next to the Nevada and Arizona border. So when these 2007 guidelines were established, they realized they needed to, or they basically figured out how those 2 reservoirs would work. Those 2007 guidelines are going to be expiring in 2026. And so the big negotiations you keep hearing about in the news right now are all about how we need to manage the river after 2026. There's lots of high stakes issues that the states have been in disagreement over. The process has been going on since June 2023, 2022. It's been going on for years. These talks have stalled in several different instances over some different issues that I'll get into. But I just want to continue to highlight who has a stake in the Colorado River before we go much further. We've also got 30 tribal nations, and then it extends into Mexico. This map on the left here doesn't show how it extends into Mexico, but 2 states in Mexico also draw from the Colorado River. So I'm sure you're interested in why there's a May deadline and what these high stakes issues are. One of the things that is informing this May deadline, you might have read about it in The Sun recently, is in order to have plans in place by 2026, if you're just tracking time backwards, you have required comment periods, public information periods, analyses that have to happen. And so the states, so there's not that much time for anyone in the basin to submit their ideas for how the river should be managed going forward. So there have been quite a few people and entities that have submitted ideas on how the river should be managed going forward, including environmental groups and tribal nations and different water experts. The one that we talk about the most, though, is the 7-state agreement. We talk about that so much because if the 7 states can come to an agreement, then that will basically tell the federal government, oh, the basin has kind of figured out its issues, and this is a plan that we should really try and highlight. That's what officials have said in different public appearances. So we don't know if they're going to reach an agreement. They've been really stalled out for a long time, but they've said in a March presentation that they might try and figure out the issues by May. So keep an eye out for news stories coming up on that topic. And I keep talking about, oh, and I just want to also say the federal government has released its own alternatives at this point, its own ideas for how it might structure this management plan. These ideas cover which reservoirs we're talking about when we're talking about Colorado River management. Are we talking about just Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell on the Utah-Arizona border? Are we and Lake Mead and Hoover Dam? Just those two? Or are we talking about other reservoirs like those in the upper basin, which you can kind of see on this map here, includes Colorado. And so there's an divide, there's an issue between the upper basin and lower basin over which reservoirs get used. The federal plans also talk about how much water could get cut. That's another big source of disagreement over how the river should be managed. That's the idea of cuts comes into play when we're talking about really dry scenarios in the river. I think I have a slide for that, but if you're looking at this slide, basically these are projections for how the hydrology, how wet or dry and how hot or not as hot the basin could be. And so there's lots of different ways that that models have shown the future of the basin could look like. And so we're seeing that we have some wetter options and some drier options, but in the driest of the dry, the water managers have to plan for those scenarios. And that's where we get a lot of the disagreement over how water would get cut in the driest of the dry scenarios. We could talk about that some more later. If you have questions on it, write them down. I'm happy to explain it in more depth. But we have these different federal alternatives. They're looking at these different ways, different components of how the basin is managed. There's 5 of them. And one of those we're not really counting it. It's called the no action alternative. The officials have to include it as part of the federal process. But the other 4 do include some different conservation goals in the upper basin and water cuts in the lower basin. We just wrote about that as well. And so when we're looking at what's in the news about Colorado River issues, a lot of it does center on these federal alternatives. Again, there are 4 of those, not counting the 5th that's required. And then there's these 2, the upper basin and the lower basin have submitted their own competing proposals. So what does all this mean to Coloradans? Well, it means that we are looking at a future in which conservation of Colorado River water is more of a likelihood. We don't know what's going to be in the final plan yet. We're not going to know for a little while, but most of the plans call for the upper basin states to conserve a lot of water, not as much as the lower basin would have to cut, but 200,000 acre feet is a commonly cited number. And so that's supposed to be voluntary, temporary, and compensated conservation under a lot of these proposed management plans. So that's one thing that water users in Colorado might be looking at. But then there's also the idea of, could the lower basin legally force the upper basin to deliver a certain amount of water under water law? And that kind of scares some people. It's a concept called compact compliance. It worries water officials because, if we're being legally forced to deliver water downstream, but we don't have enough water, what does that mean for Colorado? So there's but that's more of an out there scenario, not too far out there, according to some experts, but it's not a this year problem. So that's some of the stuff that is on people's minds in Colorado. And really, we're looking at just what I'm tracking the most when I'm doing my job for covering the Colorado River is these negotiations. So I'm sure you all would have some questions on that. I think that it does get pretty complicated, but if there's just one or two things that I'd want you to take away from this, it's that even if the states agree, come to a 7-state consensus, even if all 7 states agree on how they want to manage the basin, their proposal still has to be analyzed by the federal government. The federal government still has to put that proposal or whatever its analysis shows, a draft of a management plan through a public information process before it can be finalized. And so this is not the final decision that's coming up potentially in May if the state negotiators can meet their own deadlines, but it would be a really good indicator of what the river's future could look like. If there's anything else that I would want you all to take from this, it's that so far the plans include a lot of conservation talk for the upper basin. However, the lower basin plan does include required water cuts for Colorado and the other upper basin states. So there's something to keep an eye on, is how much, like whether Colorado's water would need to be voluntarily conserved or whether there would be required cuts in the mix. That's something that I'm watching. And then just what it means for growth in all of the basin states when we're talking about our future water management, water supply, climate impacts, and all of the different components that change how the Colorado River flows. So I hope that helps as like a brief overview, and I'm sure you have some questions because I went over a lot and it is maybe some things need to be clarified. But yeah, thanks so much for listening.
Thanks, Shannon. Lots of great info there. So type your questions, save your questions, and we'll come back to that after we hear from Jerd. So next up, we have Jerd Smith, our Freshwater News editor.
Hi, everybody. Hey, thanks for joining us today and listening to what we have to say. You know, news people are usually on the other side of the table. We usually listen to what other people are telling us and then report on it. So today you guys get to do that while we tell you what we think is interesting and important in water news these days. So outside the Colorado River, as many of you know, there are so many things going on in Colorado water. And of course, because we play such a major role in water in the West, what happens here, I think, is very important. So the 3 stories that I want to talk about this morning, or I guess this afternoon, are what's going on with Denver Water and the preliminary injunction that has been stayed, that has, if the injunction had stayed, of course, this massive multi-million-dollar dam project would be sitting in the weather while these legal questions are being worked out. As many of you may or may not know, there has been an emergency appeal, and as a result of this pending appeal, construction is going to be allowed to go forward while the federal appeals court considers the arguments from Denver Water as well as the arguments from the environmental groups, largely Save the Colorado, who feel that the federal government did not do enough to adequately analyze the impacts of climate change and declining stream flows when they were analyzing this project. The other 2 stories that I want to talk about are, in my mind, and again, this is so important and it is beyond, in a way, wonky. As a water reporter, I have to tell you, any week that I have to write about wastewater, it's like, how who wants to read about wastewater, really, not a lot of us, unless you run a water utility that has a wastewater treatment component. But there is so much going on in water quality in Colorado right now. And it's so critical because we all want to have safe water to drink. And that means that our wastewater has to be treated appropriately to do that. And it is a big, big challenge. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about briefly is what's going on with funding for water in Colorado. we have been, right now, this year anyway, for 25-26, the Colorado Water Conservation Board is not being as hard hit as certain other agencies are in terms of having to cut or give back funds to the state to help balance the budget. Still, the state continues to look for money in order to fund the Colorado Water Plan to make sure that the state has enough water to stave off shortages that are projected to be as high as 750,000 acre feet by 2050. And so this year, what I think something to watch and something that will be interesting to see is whether this bill that will create basically a funding group, a funding task force, a funding panel that will look at how to reduce our reliance on severance taxes, which, as many of you may or may not know, these are extractive taxes on oil and gas production and other things as well, minerals, but it's volatile. And sometimes it has been tapped by the legislature to help fill holes in other parts of the state budget, but again, very volatile. So they're going to be looking at that and coming up with new alternatives, and that should be very, very interesting. As of now, severance taxes and money from sports betting has provided a huge amount of are really becoming the backbone of funding for Colorado water programs through the Colorado Water Conservation Board. No one expected that to happen, but I think these are the things that we'll want to keep an eye on in the next year. We could see, if lawmakers are able to do the work that they want to do, I think we could see some fairly big changes in the severance tax, that people are talking about. So coming back to the Denver Water Gross Reservoir situation, there are a ton of interesting aspects to this. How does a $bazillion huge dam expansion program get stopped midstream? How did we get to this point? And we'll keep your eye on Freshwater News and the Colorado Sun in the next few days. We'll be writing extensively about that. But one of the other things that I think it probably gets lost in the noise is that what Save the Colorado argued, successfully or not, that's still an open question, but they've made ground with this argument, which is that, climate change is dramatically reducing stream flows in the Colorado River and elsewhere. And the federal government did not do a good enough job of analyzing the impact of these reductions in water supply when they were considering this dam. And while that sounds wonky on the surface, if they succeed here, I think it will change the way all water projects, all water supply is calculated in the West. And I think many more regional or local water utilities are probably already doing that. I suspect that Denver Water would say, we've already analyzed that. That's why we're building Gross. We know our stream flows are going to go down. That's why we need a bigger pool to store it. But it could have big ripple effects beyond Colorado. And I think that is a very interesting, important issue to keep an eye on. Then with regard to water quality, one of the, as you all may or may not know, the Water Quality Control Division, which is a division of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, has been dealing with a very, very large backlog in wastewater discharge permits. And wow, is that hard to get into a headline. But anyway, and the problem is that because some permits have been operating in a sort of, they call it an administratively continued manner, which allows dischargers to keep discharging. But for some, like we wrote last week, in the last couple of weeks, I've written about these small towns And I believe Akron, I think, you know, tiny town, 1,700 people out on the Eastern Plains. They've been operating under an expired permit for at least 8 years. And in that 8-year period, the regulations changed a lot. And so when the CDPHE began working on new regulations to implement new standards, like how damaging is ammonia, for instance, and they're so-called nutrient standards. So they adopted these standards 3 years ago. They had a very extensive public process, but because these permits have been allowed to operate in this suspended mode for such a long period of time, these small towns said they had no idea that they were going to have to meet these incredibly stringent new guidelines. And, you know, you can argue whether they should have been paying more attention or whether the state should have been more rigorous in its outreach to make sure that everyone knew what they were trying to do. But it is a tough, tough problem. And the CDPHE and the Water Quality Control Division, they have, by everyone I've ever talked to, Colorado has one of the most inclusive and rigorous regulating processes in the country. And they reach out to hundreds, if not thousands of people on a monthly and annual basis to try and include people in what they're doing. And I think that's commendable. The issue is, for most of us, what they do is highly technical. And it's, you know, based on very important science that changes all the time. And it's incredibly hard to keep up with. I think it's hard for the experts to keep up with, let alone somebody running a wastewater treatment plant in Crested Butte, for instance. And so this problem is only going to get worse. And I hate to say that because there is a lot of good news out there and we often don't report it. So I hate to, you know, suggest that this is bad news, but I don't think it's good news, to tell you the truth, because stream flows will continue to shrink as a result of warming temperatures. Populations will continue to grow, so they will be discharging more wastewater. If you guys I have this in this happy place I go to in my head when I'm tired of writing about bad news. I think, well, how could we solve this problem? And I'm really hopeful that there's some great technologist / scientist at MIT or Colorado School of Mines who will be able to just plug in something at a wastewater treatment plant that costs $5,000 and it'll take care of everything. It'll take care of ammonia and PFAS and lead and mercury and all the things that are making our water so difficult to treat to drinking water standards. So that's a big story. I would absolutely keep my eye on that. And then how am I doing on time, Caitlin?
You're doing great, Jerd. You have like 15 minutes if you wanted it, but I think you don't need it.
Okay. I've got, yeah, so I think those are the other news story that we will continue to look at this year is that, as you all know, it's dry out there. You know, there are parts of Colorado that have gotten a really healthy snowpack, but there are big parts of the state that haven't. The Rio Grande, wow, is it dry down there? And they have so many other issues they're trying to deal with. No good news for the Rio Grande at all this year in terms of snowpack. And the other thing that I think is interesting, and that I haven't written about it extensively, but it's important. And here's what underlies, you know, these new numbers that we're looking at. So there was a period of time, as many of you guys remember, when all the weather scientists, the hydrologists, the National Weather Service, they all used a particular time period to say, wow, we had, you know, what's the standard, what's the average, and how do we compare with that average now? So that time period switched 1 or 2 years ago. And so it's using a much drier period now to say what's average, what's standard, etc. And so I've got, I was contacted by somebody, 10 days or so ago about, look, I thought snowpack was average. Why is it dry? Well, the averages today are much drier than they used to be. And so even when we have an average snowpack, I think we're going to start to see very dry soils. We're going to start to see stream flows, again, very, very low. And only in years where we have help from Mother Nature, and I mean like a 3-foot snowstorm at the end of March, which are not uncaught, we get those from time to time. But we are just dealing with a much, much drier world. And so to me, when I see that average snowpack number, I always think, doesn't look like average, but dry is average now. I guess that would be the message on that right now. And yeah, I think those are most of the things I wanted to talk about. Happy to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Jerd. And
Sure.
thanks, Shannon. Shannon, do you want to turn your camera back on? And maybe to both Shannon and Jerd, is there anything that you guys kind of like ran past too quickly that you want to elaborate further on, or should we move into questions?
Well, ran past a lot of things quite quickly. I would welcome any questions about these different alternatives I mentioned for how to manage the Colorado River Basin, or just basics on the Colorado River Basin. You can put them in however you need to put them in. But also, like Jerd was saying, we've been writing a lot about our current in Colorado water conditions this year, and can talk a little bit more about that. I don't know, Jerd, is there anything else that you'd want to talk more about right now?
I think, one of the other big issues that we'll continue to track in Colorado, and that I think is always nuanced enough that it's hard to get across to people, is, people still say, right, maybe rightly so, maybe not, that if we stopped growing, we'd have enough water. If there were no new houses, we'd have enough water. Or if we could control growth so that if we could reduce our use by 10%, would we have enough water? And so the thing I always try and keep in the forefront of those discussions is that yes, growth is a problem, but here are two complicating factors, right? One, we have a housing shortage in this state. We have a housing shortage nationwide. So, and as a result, we have an affordability crisis according to certain metrics. And so shouldn't we be building more? That's one nuance that we need to think about when we talk about, oh, we should stop growing to save water. And then the other point that I think sometimes gets lost is that municipal water use is a tiny, tiny amount of the water that is generated in the state every year and used. And so there's an argument to be made, and some people do make this argument that, we need to focus on how to reduce our use of ag water. But then obviously that is, it's never as easy as you think. I remember a very, very, very prominent water attorney, and I'm not going to name names, standing up in front of a group of Arkansas River Basin growers and saying, you're going to have to cut water use by 10%. That's all there is to it. And then we'll get through this crisis. But what many of you may have seen, and what I have certainly reported on a lot, is the impact of, and the, again, really challenging work of figuring out ways to use agricultural water, to use less of it, less wet water. Let's not talk about water efficiency. I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole, even if you ask me to. Let's just say cut agricultural water use. How do we do that and maintain these farm economies? It is fiendishly difficult. And to do it in a wholesale, you know, buy and dry, for lack of a better term, way, does not provide the kind of protection that agricultural communities need in the state. And as those of you who followed some of this reporting that's being done, we did some major work on this last year. Mike Booth at the Sun and I did, taking a look at, and as part of that, I analyzed the most recent agricultural census data. And I was shocked that the number of agricultural acres in this state have dropped by nearly 30% in the last 25 years. So all the things the state has been saying about, oh, we're going to save agriculture, irrigated ag lands, irrigated ag is critically important. It hasn't been that effective because land continues to get dried up and ag economies continue to shrink. And as I'm sure some of you have been following the stuff coming out of the lower Arkansas, where farmers, for the first time in a very long time, are becoming sort of activists, and they are showing up at town halls and protesting. As in Colorado Springs, they've been protesting this large annexation, and saying that if you think for one hot second that this kind of massive growth is not going to have an impact on our water supplies, you are sorely mistaken. And they absolutely want the state to do more, to be more aggressive, to protect their economies, to protect their ability to grow melons and strawberries and avocado. No, I guess no avocados in Colorado. What am I thinking of? I won't. Whoever's been to the farm stand down outside Pueblo recently. Anyway, you know, these are all wildly important things. And I do think there is some good news on the ag water scene. There's a young grower. I haven't talked with him in several months since last year. I'm hoping to check in with him again this summer. But he is experimenting with a new kind of cotton that actually uses something like half of what a traditional cotton crop used to use. And it's very, so he can use the water he has he can grow more with what he has. He has enough so that he can actually lease his to Colorado Springs, much to the dismay of some of his neighbors. But this is allowing a young farm family to do work that they've never been able to do before, and to do it with less water than they were ever able to do it with before. And I think this kind of innovation will catch on. I think as we get more science, we will see improvements there. And I think that is good news. So, yeah, I think that's all I had on that.
Okay. Well, with that, let's turn it over to questions. So if anybody has a question in mind, you're welcome to hop on and speak up or raise your hand in the chat function, I guess, the reaction function. You can type a question into the chat.
It's like Brian has one.
And I'll start.
Thanks, Brian.
Jerd and Shannon, thank you guys for your coverage. And it's nice to see people staying on top of these issues. And I have more questions, I think, than I started with. But my first one is just a statement that I think the judge's decision in Gross Reservoir is the worst way to do business in the entire world. And that I don't know, you can never, for some people, you'll never be able to study it enough. And I think Denver Water has studied it enough. I'll leave it at that. My question was going to be, though, Shannon, and I haven't been paying enough attention with the Colorado River stuff. I'm a little worried about the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Reclamation, who ultimately have the say-so in this. And I'm not sure Do we have appointments on those positions yet? Do we have a commissioner? Do we have, I guess one of my concern is just who the heck is going to make the decision if there's nobody in those roles?
Yeah, okay, yeah, we do have obviously a head of the Department of Interior. Last time I checked, we didn't have the cabinet or the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science is an important position, and then the Reclamation Commissioner. I'm looking it up right now for you, but last time I checked, we didn't. And so the after the election, before our inauguration day, I had a conversation with the different state negotiators. We have 7 state negotiators, 1 in each state, right? And they're the ones who are at the center of representing the states in these conversations. And I talked with them and I asked them, how do you think a change in administration right now might or might not affect Colorado River proceedings? And part of their response was, we're so deep in this federal process at this point, we're kind of just chugging along. It was what they said in November, that they're following the NEPA process. It has so many different steps in it. They're so far along. They've gotten to the point where they've identified 5 draft alternatives. And so the assumption at that time was just that the machine would keep chugging along, and that a 7-state agreement would help guide the federal government in the decision-making process. The feds have said many times that they would really take such an agreement into consideration. They're not trying to make a decision for the basin. They want the basin to make a decision for itself, but they're ready to put plans into action if the basin can't agree. So long story short, to answer your question, I mean, my understanding is that things are chugging along, even without heads in the different various positions that are important for this. Caveat to that, though, there was an inkling of concern raised back in November about whether, I guess the Bureau of Reclamation has served in the past to force consensus amongst the states by saying, if you don't agree, we're going to do this, and that's something you don't want. And that in recent years has caused them to reach an agreement faster. So that's a valuable role. Some of the negotiators told me that that's a valuable role Reclamation has played in the past. Without that strong role, I guess the worry was that maybe the consensus would take longer to be reached. But yeah, I guess we'll see what really comes out in May. That's the next time when we're expecting some sort of update from the states. Thanks for your question, Brian.
And then we have another hand raised, JB Jordan. Do you want to unmute yourself, and you could turn on your camera if you want and ask?
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, perfect.
Yes.
Hi, thanks. I have worked with Shannon and with Jerd. I work for Colorado Springs Utilities, and specifically on some of the water sharing program we have down in the Lower Arkansas Valley. I wanted to follow up to Jerd's comment. I believe she was speaking to Caleb Wirtz. He is the young farmer who grew an experimental cotton field this last year. And he is one of our water sharing partners, and Jerd is exactly right that, for young farmers to stay in farming, and some of what we're seeing is the average age of the farmer being older and older. I think it's nearly 60 now across the country, and that's certainly the case probably in Colorado as well. Younger farmers are finding it cost prohibitive to get into farming. So Caleb's a great example of a farmer who is a generational farmer in the Lower Ark Valley and wanted to continue farming. I did want to clarify a couple of things there, though. I first want to acknowledge that we truly understand this and are doing our best to work with farmers to find solutions that work for them in the Lower Arkansas Valley. And so our program has evolved even in the last few years. Jerd mentioned leasing. Actually, where most of the Lower Ark Valley irrigated are still opportunity to come in and through investments in pivot irrigation, which is of course a little more efficient there. We help young farmers like Caleb do this, but we also provide that risk mitigation for you. So he's trialing a new crop. He didn't know how it was going to work exactly. But we can provide that backing, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking to the future and what works for farmers. We very much value that agricultural community and want to ensure that we're working to serve there. So I wish we could see a little more forward look also. When you look at the state plan, the Colorado Water Plan, how it identifies opportunities there. And then you look at agriculture as a $47 billion industry in the state, using 90% of the water. You know, that's a smaller percentage of the state's GDP. How can cities be working with agriculture on innovative solutions that supports both? And in some of our work with farmers, we found, for example, that 3 and 10 lease agreements doesn't always work well for them. I think it depends on the crop they're growing. And, you know, fallowing some years just doesn't work. And they prefer some of the installation and using and then we acquire those, the water that can come off the corners, which when you think about it in a 3 and 10, which is focused on 30%, it actually comes out a little bit lower. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I think looking forward, there is a lot of opportunity to come in, and we are asking agriculture to leverage us. We're a forest service utility. In what other ways can we be involved in our region to make sure everyone can be successful? As example, you know, we participate in voluntary flow program in the Upper Arkansas. There are just ways that I think that if everyone gets creative and really thinks about it, that we can continue to collaborate and find solutions, so that it isn't, you know, as a municipal versus agriculture problem. It's how we can come together, given the challenges of a changing climate and drought and less things, just as Jerd spoke to. And I just wanted to leave that there and hope that you all are pursuing some of that in future stories.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
We had another question pop into the chat from India. She said, regarding Colorado River negotiation scenarios, will there be any improvement in water available for ecosystems along the river and in the estuary of the Sea of Cortez? Any thoughts on that, Shannon?
You know, some of that is tied to the Mexico, okay, so there's different negotiations happening. There's negotiations happening within the United States, between all of the different stakeholders in the states and the federal government. And then there's also negotiations happening between Mexico and the US. I'm less familiar with those. I don't cover them as often. And so as far as agreements to send surges down to help the estuary or any, I don't know, like that, we'll see about what happens with the very end of the Colorado River Basin or Colorado River. And then I think as far as like within the United States, maybe there's one alternative called the Cooperative Conservation Alternative. This is something that the Bureau of Reclamation put forward, but it was really based off of some suggestions from environmental groups in the river basin. And so, you know, they definitely have environmental and ecosystem benefits in mind, both just throughout the basin, through the Grand Canyon area. And I don't know how, nobody knows whether, like, how the components of their proposal would be incorporated into a final agreement at this point in time. So I'd say keep an eye out. I interview folks regularly who are involved in environmental management and advocacy in different areas in the Colorado River Basin. So I do try and make sure I'm updating our understanding of their priorities and coverage. So keep an eye out for coverage, especially when and if we do get an update in May. We'll be reaching out to folks to see what they think about any sort of consensus agreement and whether it would fulfill the different needs, the various needs in the river basin. Thanks for the question, India.
While we're waiting for other questions to pop up, Caitlin, do we have any others right at this second, right at this moment?
I don't think so. So raise your hands, type your questions in.
Okay. So one of the things that I would love to ask you, all of you, is what do you think are some of the most important water stories that we need to be covering? What do you think are the most important that we need to keep covering, or what are some things that you're seeing that you feel are really hopeful or really concerning? So I'm not sure what the question is here. I just saw wildfire in a chat.
Is that just
Hello.
interest in us? Hi. Hey, Megan.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed. Our biggest concern, and all the partners we work with, municipalities, state, federal, local counties, is wildfire and impacts to water quality. Definitely very nervous about upcoming wildfire season, and yeah, this is just always an issue and concern for us. So if you're ever looking to cover those issues, also, things that we're trying to do within, the community to not only protect communities, but try to reduce these high severity wildfires is, there's a lot of work being done around that. We've got the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative, as well as other groups trying to address these issues. So please reach out to me if you want to talk more about wildfire and water
Sure.
nexus.
Do you believe that, after East Troublesome and after that, that crazy, scary summer,
2020,
so that was 5 years ago.
yes.
Do you see, are things any better than they were then? It sounded the last time I weighed in on this, and again, it's been a while, it's probably been, I don't think I've written a wildfire story for a year, but there was a tremendous amount of work being done to make the watersheds, like for the left hand, St. Vrain left hand, their whole territory, which for those of you who don't know is basically includes parts of Boulder County, Weld, parts of Larimer. Do you see it? Do you feel like good work has occurred since 2020? And will it help?
Yeah, I think a lot of organization has happened at all different levels, federal, state, and local. Obviously at the federal level, we're really challenged. I mean, we're all really excited about a lot of the legislation that the Biden administration passed, recognizing, forests as infrastructure, and a lot of funding was coming down the pipeline. And now it's just kind of getting turned off. That's a huge concern. And the Colorado Water Conservation Board, they have they have funding and programs related to this issue, wildfire ready action planning, and a lot of work's being done there. So yes, we are moving forward and doing a lot of organizing and trying to implement more landscape scale treatments. And so I'm really hopeful about those efforts, but I'm very concerned about federal funding moving forward.
Yeah, we've had.
Yeah, sorry, I could go on and on, but
No, it's okay. Not to interrupt. I'm just agreeing. I mean, part of what Jerd and I have both spent time and effort on is trying to understand and update folks on the federal funding policies and any impacts in Colorado. So just wide invitation to folks in, wherever your project is at, if you're trying to get something done, and we'd love to hear what your experience has been over the past few months. And I also see a few more things, not to separate us from wildfire. I know it's a big topic, and I am in Southwest Colorado. I live in Durango. I just looked up, I get my water from the Animas watershed, just looked up how we're doing there, and it was at 58% already melting off, and we're in like late April. And so, but also I'm seeing some great other topics in the chat here, and I just wanted to respond to Christy a little bit. I love covering how students are engaging in water stuff. And so if you have, I grabbed your email, but if anyone has exposure to interesting things that students are doing and how our the younger folks in Colorado are engaging with these issues, please feel free to send them along. It sounds like an interesting project that they're doing. And then John, hi, nice to see you. There's a lot of stuff happening with water measurement science. For example, speaking of funding, there was some federal funding that was supposed to go to the Upper Colorado River Commission for water measurement devices. I believe it was on hold for a second, but I believe it's been released. That was something that we were talking about at the recent Southwestern Water Conservation District seminar in late March. And so, you know, there's interesting things happening with the rulemaking and with our ability to measure the actual flow of water through our streams with a degree of accuracy that's greater than what we've had. And I think part of that is related, at least in the Colorado River Basin, related to how well we would be able to, if there ever was a call on the Colorado River, if we ever had to legally, you know, make sure we were completing our compact compliance requirements. How do we do that? Well, if we don't know how much water is flowing through which rivers and where, then how do we actually ensure we can comply with the Interstate River Compact? So interesting stuff there for sure. Definitely have our ears to the ground. And if it's not a sexy topic, it's hard to make interesting to our general audience. And so if you have any really cool projects or cool character or like cool people you know who are working on that topic, let us know, because that helps people engage with something like water measurement. Thanks, John.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm just reading through some of these things. Yeah, I think, you know, another thing that I'm gonna plan to be writing about this year is the cost of water. Which, you know, again, I think there are small communities out there who are already seeing major increases in their water bills. And that's going to continue, you know, and there's always been an argument in the American West that if people were charged the true cost of water, we wouldn't have overuse, everything would be more efficient, et cetera. But, you know, the reality of the history of water development in the West is that most of our really large, big delivery system, like the Colorado Big Thompson, to a lesser extent, you know, the big storage and delivery systems that Denver Water built long ago when it was much cheaper to do, those were heavily subsidized, not Denver Water maybe so much, but certainly if you look at these big federal projects out there. And so for a long time, our water was really affordable, if not downright cheap. And that is just not the case anymore. And it is not going to continue to be the case. And I'm hearing from, you know, small town people, which I love to hear from everybody, because it helps us, as Janet said, as Shannon said, it helps us stay in touch with different communities across the state. And invariably people reach out to me and I learn something that I didn't know before, and it helps inform my reporting as I move forward. But the cost of water is going up. It just is.
We, just to follow up on that, have interesting legislation going through the state legislature right now about tap fees, which is part of how the cost of water translates into home prices. The Colorado Sun did a project called High Cost last year, in which we did a bit of an analysis on how water utilities are changing in different, like our monthly bills are changing in different areas, and you know how much aging infrastructure there is, and the big cost that these water providers are going to have to address. And interestingly, I did a meet and greet, like a News and Brews event in Durango last week, and someone there said that they're selling water, they have too much water, selling it for $100 an acre foot. And I was like, are you sure? Like that, what?
That's
and
a great story. Who was
I
it?
know, yeah, but it was interesting. They were like, don't quote me on that. But here I am. I'm not saying their name. Anyway, but it was just interesting because I'm sure that's quite different from some other areas of Colorado, or maybe and maybe not really common. But it was definitely an interesting little tidbit that I got. If anybody wants to do a News and Brews event, happy to do it. It's more of just a meet and greet and to say hi casually. So keep us in mind. I see in here from Brian a question about sourcing. I think we do try and vary our sources quite a bit, but this is just a good reminder to make sure that when we're covering issues, to always look for more and more perspectives. So thank you for that. And is anyone advocating for transparency? Thanks, John, in the water accounting in the lower basin. I'd say yes, the upper basin negotiators are advocating for transparency. They have mentioned it many, many times in discussions. Essentially, just for a bit of context, how the two basins account for water is super massively different. How the two basins get how water users in the two basins get water is different, because in the lower basin, they have contracts with the federal government to tap into the water that's stored in our huge immense reservoirs like Lake Mead. And so it's a very different structure for how they view their relationship with water, really. But also there's questions about which tributaries they're counting as part of their usage. And there's questions about, just in general, why there hasn't been a lot of transparency in filings with the federal government about how much the lower basin is using, or how much water the lower basin is using. There's questions about how we're counting evaporation like water loss during the evaporative process. So there's lots of questions that the upper basin negotiators have raised about how the lower basin is accounting for its water use. The overall point the upper basin folks are trying to make is that they believe there's overuse happening in the lower basin. Lower basin folks, of course, disagree in certain ways. And so that's a whole nother area of the Colorado River negotiations. But yes, I believe there's been a lot of talk about increasing transparency around water accounting, and that's something that I have on my radar to keep pursuing. And I know probably, John, you'll be pursuing it as well. So thanks for the question. Let's see. India, you have some, I'm just kind of going to take a second to look through it. I don't know, Jerd, did you see anything that you wanted to respond to?
I did want to respond to Brian's question about, other sources beyond Gary Walkner, for instance, who, as many of you probably know, is the activist who succeeded in securing an environmental settlement, $100 million settlement with the Northern Integrated Supply Project, and who is also the activist who brought suit and won this short-lived injunction to stop the continued construction of Gross Reservoir. So, Brian, as you probably know, you were such an amazing PIO for such a long time. There are certain people who are I would call foundational to a story. And when you're writing about a lawsuit, you have to interview the people who filed the lawsuit and the people who are being sued. But for stories where that is not the case, we absolutely do. And I absolutely do reach out to many, many different environmental interests in the state who, as you know, many of them are very different, and they have different working relationships, and it's definitely not, it's not a monolith for sure. There are many different views out there and many different ways of going about solving problems.
Thanks. Jerd, maybe both of us can tackle parts of this. I have one thought on it, then maybe you can jump in. But to India's question about what are the measurements behind the conclusion that agriculture uses nearly all of Colorado water? But what India's mentioning there is, and we've gotten this information from the state before, that like how much actually agriculture or water users use in the state of Colorado. And I believe that it's, what is it, like over nearly 90% of the water use. A bit of context there, like when we're thinking of water use, it has to do a little with how the West was settled, just to take us back a little bit, because we were settled primarily as agricultural water users. So in our system of water law, older water rights have seniority over younger water rights, right? And so a lot of our older water rights are tied to agriculture, or have been in the past. And so when we're thinking of how Colorado has developed over the past decades, dominating agricultural use at the beginning and becoming increasingly urban in certain areas of the state, that's some bit of context for why we have so much agricultural water rights that are senior, and why that use is so big. I think it's 90% goes to irrigate farms and ranches, and cities and towns are about 7% of the state's overall use of water each year. That's from Colorado Water Plan, CWCB. That's where those numbers come from. You had asked about water quality impacts. I report less on water quality. I know of some, but I'm not as much of an authority. I don't know, Jerd, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I'm just rereading the question real quick. So, agricultural water does contribute to water quality issues. Fertilizers, all kinds of issues. So it absolutely does have an impact on water quality. And cities, of course, via their wastewater discharge, also have an impact on water quality. I think there has been, I can remember years ago standing on the banks of the South Platte River with Hal Simpson, who was the head of the Division of Water Resources back in the early 2000s. And there were all these people swimming and kayaking. I said, wow, Hal, I don't know if I would do that in the South Platte. I'm just not sure it's clean enough. He said, wow, you should have seen it before the Clean Water Act. So, and I say that to say that we've made amazing progress in treating water and cleaning up rivers due to regulation, not just in an urban setting, but also in an agricultural setting. Still more work to be done, but absolutely an impact. I think a lot of progress has been made. I'm still not swimming in the South Platte, though. Can I just say that?
I had a question for y'all. I have to go to Phoenix, Arizona next week and then Tucson, Arizona for some conferences. I'm doing some reporting while I'm down there. I'm curious what questions folks have about Arizona when it comes to water, about Phoenix. If you want to punch anything into the chat, I'd love that. And I think it'll be an interesting trip. And so let us know. I'm also, I wanted to just throw this out there while I'm asking you all questions. We're getting into the spring runoff time period, and I think one of the interesting parts of Colorado water law is this idea of the free river condition. And so I'm looking for anyone who has expertise in how free river water runs through Colorado, anybody who relies on it maybe for their agricultural operation, or just has other uses for it. But if anybody has any familiarity with free river water in Colorado, let me know.
And one thing before we let you guys go, I think I'm going to put this into the chat, but I just want to make sure that I always like people to know where they can find me. It's super important. So I'm going to put my email and my direct phone number into the chat. So if you guys have any story ideas or concerns or hopes or anything, feel free to reach out to me. I sometimes miss an email, but not that often, honestly. And I will call you back if you call me.
I'll put mine in there as well. And I'm just seeing some other questions pop up.
Okay, what else are you seeing?
How much time do we have, Caitlin? Sorry, I don't remember when we end.
So we promoted this webinar with 2 different timeframes.
Oh, cool.
So we understand if anyone needs to hop off, because you might have thought we ended at 1, or you might have thought we end at 1:30. So I think we can keep taking questions if Jerd and Shannon are up to it. But if anyone needs to go, that's okay too.
Cool. Thank you for some input into maybe questions for Arizona. Love it. I have a question from James about the System Conservation Pilot Program. If anyone is curious about this, this was a program that used federal funding to essentially pay farmers, ranchers, other water users in the upper basin, so Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming, to cut their water use. And we did a pilot, the basin did a pilot for it in 2015 through 2018. They relaunched in 2023, did a 2024 year. So thanks, James, for a question about it. Let's see. So one of the criticisms, you're echoing one of the criticisms of the program, which was basically, we know how much the agricultural, most of the people that participated were agricultural water users. Everyone was invited, just so I'm going to talk about mostly farmers and ranchers, but most of the farmers and ranchers, we know how much they cut their water use by, but once the water like left their land, we don't really know where it went. The state has described, the state of Colorado has described it as system conservation in that it stays in the river to help the river system, but we don't know if it actually ended up flowing all the way down to Powell to help boost Powell's water levels or mead or anything like that. And so I think that the loss, oh yeah, okay, so there's some other things you're mentioning there. The loss of the infrastructure funds that supported SCPP. There are still some funds attached that could go to this program. They just have not been approved by Congress. And so in our funding climate right now, I think that there's a good question of whether they would, but those funds are authorized to be, those funds could be spent through 2026. There could be one more summer, but unless Congress approves and authorizes that spending, it won't. So yeah, okay, so did it actually help with downstream water availability, or just did it help keep farmers solvent? I'll ask. I don't know. I mean, I think that yes, water did go downstream from that. How far it went downstream, we don't know. We don't know if the next user just picked it up. Have no idea. We don't know if it helped a reach of a stream that typically has really low flows and needed some more flows to, help the riparian ecosystem. There was no tracking. This was a pilot study. I think what the state would probably say in response to this is that it's a pilot study. They're trying to understand what the volunteer effort might look like for conservation in general. I have questions about the efficiency for how it was cast, because for me, when they relaunched the program in 2023, they were the upper basin states were making the argument that this program would help them with conservation in the Colorado River Basin in response to a federal call at that time for the basin to cut its water use by several million acre feet. And so they were saying, you know what, in response to what you said, feds, I'm going to do this. This is how I'm going to help. But I don't think that the pilot program that happened after that answered the question of are they actually helping with the intended goal at that time? But I do think that they've done a lot of research to try and see how voluntarily conserved water that's compensated would actually happen in the basin. And I do think that for farmers, they have said in the first year, how much they were paid was a little bit less incentivizing. In the second year, they were paid more and it was more standard. And that was a better incentive for them to join. So I think farmers would have their own opinions on whether or not they like this program and whether or not they would want to join it again. Further context, the System Conservation Pilot Program is a really important part of the Colorado River Basin negotiations because the upper basin states have cast this as part of their strategy, their parallel activities, saying, you know what, you shouldn't be requiring us to cut water. We're going to be doing these parallel activities. We could conserve up to 200,000 acre feet. Look at SCPP. We had some people get involved there. SCPP, in its biggest year, saved 37 or cut use by 37,000 acre feet. So it's an interesting part of the Colorado River conservation conversation, basically. Thanks for the question. I don't know if that helped. If you have any follow-ups, let me know, but that's some context on that topic.
Actually, I mean, most of my experience is in Wyoming. I go to the
Mhm.
state engineers meetings for that, where they were actually there were informational meetings to the farmers to tell them what SCPP was and how they could apply for it. But it became very clear that they had no way of estimating consumptive use. I mean, they can say, well, we didn't divert this amount, but how much that turned up as return flows, they really have no idea. And they're trying to do it with satellite data and things like that, but it's really very, very sketchy. And of course, we lost it all, when the infrastructure funds were frozen, and the congressional delegation from Wyoming is trying to get them to reinstate it. But my question, there was also a lot of money that was spent on infrastructure improvements, putting in new head gates, for cities even. There was a fair amount of money that went to cities, but I really wondered how well that addressed any long-term problem other than dealing with short-term negotiations and saying this is what we're doing to address the problem, as opposed to really long-term things like changing, whole agricultural practices. Ultimately, it really is a short-term thing. And I just wanted to see what you had to say about that.
I mean, essentially, you're echoing, these are relevant questions. They're questions that I've asked folks, and also that other basin, like water experts, water users around the basin have asked. So, I mean, it's a part of the conversation. I don't think that they have answers to all of those questions. It's an interesting idea to, it was very short term. I do know that some of the irrigation water users who participated in the program said, it's fine to get this for 1 year, but it doesn't really help my operational planning. It would be better if I had multiple years of funding or some ways to participate in a program like this. And just thinking of the short term versus long term, there are some political benefits for the Upper Basin to be able to say that they're putting this project forward right now, for sure, in the negotiations. And I think that's been part of their strategy with how they're, discussing this program. But yeah, good questions. If it does get funded again, if the funding comes through, it'll be covered. So I'll be writing about it. I'll be reaching out to people about it. So stay tuned. Sorry, I don't know if I can answer anything more clearly than that, but there are valid questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've covered all the questions that were in the chat. Jerd, Shannon, do you have any kind of like closing thoughts or anything else you want to get into?
Well, we had 1 or 2 questions that came in before. If
That's
we
true.
should, one of them might inform my closing thoughts. Let me just take a quick look at the. Oh yeah, I'll just answer these a bit in my closing thoughts. Does that sound good? So some of the questions that came in before had to do more with the journalistic process, and like, what does a successful story, or what does success look like to us when we're covering different issues in Colorado, and how are we balancing big picture and local concerns. But I think what got me thinking about this is like, what does success look like for me writing about these things? And day to day, it looks like knowing that I'm accurate. It just looks like accuracy. I want to make sure that I'm asking the right people the questions that need to be asked and conveying the information accurately as clearly as possible, so that our wide array of readers can stay up to date. And so I think that what that comes with sometimes, to answer the second part of the question, is like feedback, and what kind of feedback am I looking for? I love it when people email me, even if you're concerned about what I'm covering. I think it's helpful when I hear from people who are different types of water users, and they have different opinions on a particular issue. Sometimes in journalism, we think making everyone a little mad means that we're maybe hitting the mark on our coverage. Obviously still being accurate, but like we don't want to be biased toward one perspective. So I think that, I think about these issues daily in my job, trying to do the best that our team can, to make sure that we're keeping a tap on, tapped into our water issues. So yeah, I think that it's been a challenge in the past few months for sure. Transparency is an issue right now. No one wants to talk about funding. No one wants to talk about staffing or the impacts in Colorado, thinking of how we're connecting our local issues to broader issues. Our job is to tell stories that can cast a light on what's happening in Colorado and to help everyone in this state understand what's happening. And so I think when I try and do that, I'm often learning as much as I can about a local issue, and often trying to, in my stories, make that clear how that fits into a broader national issue, and vice versa, how a national issue might filter down. But mainly we need help from readers. We need people to suggest questions and ideas and people to talk to. We definitely don't want to be working in a silo. We want to be as plugged in as possible to what the conversations are in the state. So a little bit of an ask. Thank you so much for joining a webinar like this. And also thank you for reading our coverage. And keep doing it, and email me. And I'll put my email in the chat so that you actually have it. But yeah, some closing comments in answer to some of the questions we got. Jerd, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess in terms of, accuracy is obviously a huge deal, and water is can be a very technical, nuanced thing, and people's definitions vary tremendously. And you can say there's water in the river, fair enough, but not at that point, and not at this point, and not at that time of year, and not at that time of year. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. So it's always one of the challenges is always writing in a way that I always say somebody having a cup of coffee at the McDonald's in Thornton can understand, but that which also captures some of the nuance. It's not, I have people who are long-time water engineers, water consultants, people from the School of Mines. Let me tell you, they let me know when they think I didn't get the nuance right away. And sometimes I agree with them and sometimes I don't. And it is just, that's a challenge. But I have to tell you, this job is so important and it's so rewarding. And every time I'm out in the field, or every time I talk to somebody I've never talked to before, I am struck by how many thoughtful, amazing, hardworking people there are in this world. And every time I get a chance to get their voices into an article, it makes me very, very happy. And it gives me so much hope in a time, and I tell people all this, I need to get out in the field. I need to talk to people. I don't need to be here at my desk today. I need to be out in the field, because that's where you can really tap into the pulse of these different communities, these different water users who care so much. People care so much about what we do, and being given the privilege to report and to interview and to write about that is one of my metrics for success, and one of the things that keeps me picking up my phone and sitting down at my desk and reading, the latest report from the U.S. Agricultural Statistics Service. Know what I mean? Yeah. So
I will share that. Ditto also.
Well, thank you both. Thanks, Jerd. Thanks, Shannon. Thank you everyone for being here. Great questions, great conversation, inspiring thoughts. Reach out to any of us if anyone has questions, and we'll share the recording of the webinar in the next week. So good to see everyone. Thanks for being here.
thank you.
Thank you.